Hi, so this is our first lecture of our module of yoga teacher training because we're going to be starting teaching a small aspect of a class. So instead of rushing straight in and trying to teach a 1-hour class, we're breaking the class down and looking at what are the important things that we need to be teaching and how are we going to be teaching them. So first, looking at the 4 aspects of training. So we have, the first one is teaching of a posture, because it is really important that the student understands about the pose. They should have a lot of information which will help them to practice it correctly and also to understand why they should be doing it. We'll go into detail about all of these points in a moment. Then instructing your students to practice the pose. So that is the pose that you have just taught. Then making any kind of corrections. And we're only going to talk about corrections briefly here because we've got a whole lecture on corrections later on in the course. And then we have revision. So revision is basically the practices that you have taught before, maybe yesterday, maybe last week, because when we're teaching a yoga class, we don't just teach a new pose, practice, new pose, practice it, new pose, practice it. We're always going to be practicing poses that we have done before. And of course, there are many classic poses that we will always be doing in our classes. We won't just leave them for something else because they have a lot of value. Things like Ardha Matsyendrasana, the half spinal twist, or Paschimottanasana, the full forward bend. So these positions are basically your core asanas. So there's always going to be practice of these in your classes. So first, looking at teaching of the pose, the posture. So first we want to have an introduction. So just a little bit of information about the position. You want to use the name. So you can say the English name, you can say the Sanskrit name. Some poses don't have a Sanskrit name because there's a lot of poses that have only been developed in recent years. And of course, some of the poses have many Sanskrit names because they've been named something different in different parts of India, and there's different ways of pronouncing as well. So even if you look at downward facing dog, that's also known as mountain pose in the north. So there can be these different Sanskrit names. None of them are wrong. They're just different. So if you hear someone say, oh, but I know that pose as Trikonasana. Oh no, I know that as side angle pose. It's okay. As long as your students understand the position that you're teaching, that's what's important. And of course, with some of these new poses, like example, you hear Nawasana. Now, that's a Sanskrit name. It sounds like very important, but actually it only means new pose. So the Sanskrit name isn't always relevant either to the position. But if possible, let us use the Sanskrit and the English. It's also important to understand who your students are and how comfortable they feel. If you're teaching beginners and you're not in India and you start using all these Sanskrit names all the time and you're not using English, it can be really, really confusing for them. So it's really important that they understand what you're going to be talking about. So saying whichever names are there. Also sometimes I find, because I usually think of the poses in Sanskrit, if there is a Sanskrit name, when I have to translate it to the English name, sometimes it's quite confusing. Like if I want to say Ekapada Hastasana, I'm translating it as one leg forward bend, which doesn't really roll off the tongue very easily. So that's why sometimes you might use the English name more, sometimes you might use the Sanskrit name more, but what's important is your students understand you. Okay, so introduction. What I also like to add in the introduction is just a little bit about the position. Like I might say that, okay, today we're going to learn Dhanurasana, the bow pose. So in this position, which is from the prone pose, we're going to be holding our ankles and pulling up our body like a bow. So that just can build a little bit more interest in your students and also a little bit of understanding of how it's going to be. The next point here says explain the preposition. So you can kind of put that into your introduction. So what is a preposition? We've got supine, prone, sitting, and standing. So as I said, you might say, okay, today we're going to learn Sarangasana, the shoulder stand, which is from the supine position. So it's very simple. You don't have to put that in, but it just helps to give a little bit more understanding about the pose. Now this next point here says the minimum time duration for gaining the benefits. Now you don't have to say this at this point, but it can be helpful for your students to understand that if they hold it for longer, these are the benefits they're going to gain. Generally, if I'm going to give the timing, I will say it towards the end once I've given the benefits. But for example, if you're going to teach Sarangasana shoulder stand, now you're teaching the pose, you've given them all these benefits, and they think that, if I hold it for 20 seconds, that's enough. I'll get all the benefits that I need. So you want to tell them, okay, you need to try to hold it for a minimum of 1 minute, up to 5 minutes, over a period of time if possible, so they know what they have to aim for. And same, if you're teaching Ardha Matsyendrasana, half spinal twist, now we're aiming to hold that pose for 2 minutes on each side. Of course, it can be held longer later on, but you'll get a lot of benefit just from that 2 minutes. So it gives them that thing to aim for. All right, then demonstration. So it's important to demonstrate the position. Now it's very, very common these days that a yoga teacher just shows the pose and expects the student to follow everything they're doing. They don't specifically teach the poses and give all the information about it. But it's really helpful if you can get your students to watch as you teach a pose, because then they'll understand a lot more about the position. It also means that they'll be able to practice it at home if they want to, because they understand it well and they'll know how to do it in the correct way without causing any kind of injury. And what happens also is if the students are just following the teacher and the poses that the teacher is doing all the time, they can injure themselves because maybe the teacher is more flexible and they're doing the pose a little bit stronger. So it's important that we have that demonstration so the students can look at it clearly and understand. And also because if you're just copying the teacher, then you can't always see exactly what the teacher is doing. If it's a supine position, you might have to twist your body around so that you can actually understand what it is. So it's really helpful to do that demonstration. Here we write to do the demonstration twice. The reason being is that if you've got a big class, maybe not everyone can see everything. So you can show it from a different angle so they'll understand it a little bit more. Also, what you can do is you can show variations. You might show some different modifications. You might also show how you want the pose to be and how you don't want the pose to be. So example, if you're teaching the plank pose, so you want to show them, okay, this is the correct position, my body's in a straight line, but you can also show them where your hips are lower, so it's kind of like a cobra, and you can also show when the bottom is sticking up, so it's kind of like a downward dog. So when they see how they shouldn't be doing it, that also helps them to understand the pose much more deeply. So having that demonstration is very helpful. Now here I put the benefit. Now the benefits you can actually start talking about from the beginning. Give a couple of benefits in the introduction and it will spark more interest. If it's possible when you're demonstrating, you can also talk about the pose. You can talk about the benefits. If I'm doing Dhanurasana, the bow pose, so I might say that all of the body weight is being put onto the abdomen. So by doing this, it's very helpful for improving circulation to the lower abdomen. It's good for constipation. It's good for reproductive problems. I can say that as I'm holding my hands, or my hands and my feet, I'm pulling my body upwards, my chest is opening, expanding, so it's helpful for improving my posture. It's helpful for increasing my lung capacity. And when I'm explaining these benefits as I'm showing them, it helps them to understand more. If I just give a list of benefits right at the end, then they can't always link the benefit to the pose. So it's good to have a little bit of benefits throughout. And I remember we had a teacher training course and one of the students said to me, But why would you want to give the benefits? My teacher doesn't give the benefits in my yoga class. And I said, well, don't you want to know? Don't you think it's helpful for your students to understand why they're going to be practicing? They're not sheep. They don't want to just copy everything you do. They want to know why they're doing it, how it's going to be helping them. And also, if they know that a certain pose will be really good for them, then they can actually practice it themselves. They can practice at home and they might even start their own personal practice. So I think it's really important to have those benefits. I think back to when I was a teenager, when I was 14, 15, when I was starting yoga, and I didn't have any health problems, but my teacher told, all the benefits of all the positions. And I found it really helpful because when I started my naturopathy practice, my massage therapy practice, I understood, okay, this will be really helpful for your posture. This is really good for your back pain. This will be really helpful for the arthritis that you have. So it's good for your students to understand and also for them to share later on and to see that there is so many deeper benefits to practicing yoga. And that's where you see that it's not a form of exercise, that we can have so much more. And then we move on to the precautions. So that is also really helpful to put in. Again, some people say, oh, but my teacher doesn't talk about precautions. Well, that's why there's so many yoga injuries these days. It's really important that our students understand what is helpful for them and what isn't going to be helpful. And here you see this list. We've put precautions at the end, and there is actually a reason for that, because if I am teaching the shoulder stand, Sarangasana, if I give the precautions at the beginning and then I teach the pose, I talk all about the benefits, then even if this student, they have high blood pressure, they have neck pain, they have a headache, they will still do the pose because they've just heard all the benefits and they've completely forgotten about those precautions. So it's important that we give precautions and contraindications when we're teaching the pose, and it's important that we remind them when we're practicing revision with them about any precautions they need to take. Often I will say that if I have a class and I know that a couple of people have back pain and I have to do a certain pose, I'll say, remember, if you've got back pain, take a variation. Remember, if you've got neck pain, instead of doing the shoulder stand, you can do Uttan Padasana, the raised leg pose. So it's important to be telling your students these things as well, because otherwise they just want to practice everything. So that's a little bit about teaching of the pose. And then we're going to be instructing our students to practice. So they've watched the demonstration, they've understood the position, they understood the variations, the do's and don'ts, the benefits, the precautions. So you're going to be giving them instructions to practice it. So here you can see, give instructions for each stage of coming into the posture with or without counts. So it's quite common to use counts in India to come into positions. But generally, in our English courses, we don't use counts unless it's for Surya Namaskar, the sun salutation. But we do use breathing and we use description of the pose or of the movement to come into the pose. So, for example, if I want to do Bhujangasana, cobra pose. So I'll say, okay, from prone position, we're going to place our hands next to our chest with our fingers pointing forward, gently pressing onto our hand, bringing our forehead down onto the ground. Exhale, and then inhaling, slowly raising your head, neck, chest, and straightening the arms if possible. So that's the kind of instructions we'll be using to come into the pose. So it's always important to use the breath to help them, and then give as much description as is needed to get into the pose. Once they're in the pose, then you want to explain the position. Okay, so example, I'm doing cobra. So once I've come into the pose, tilting your head back and opening your chest, relaxing your shoulders, bringing your heels together if possible, or just your toes, and relax. Take a deep breath in and out, and then normal breathing. So explaining how the position should be, reminding them how to breathe. If you've got a lot of talking about the final position, then you'll first remind them to breathe normally, and then you can talk about how the position should be. And when you're looking around at your students, if you see that quite a few of them are making mistakes, that's where you'll put more detail into how the position should be. So for example, if I'm teaching Viparit Kani, the inverted pose, many people might not have their legs vertical. They might be very much tilted. Their back might not be at the right angle. So I'll talk about the angle, I'll talk about what we're aiming for in the pose, how we want the legs to be vertical. If it's difficult, then we'll say bring your feet a little bit over your head. So this kind of information is important for them to understand so that they can correct themselves if needed. And as I've already mentioned, but I'll say it again, reminding them to breathe, because it's very, very common for students to talk about the breath as they come in and then forget. So many students will actually hold their breath, waiting for you to say, breathe. So it's really important that you always mention it. And then this last point here, new asana equals a short time. So example, if you've just taught the shoulder stand, Sarvangasana, you're not going to get them to hold it for 3 minutes the first time they've done it. You may hold it for 20, 30 seconds, and you usually will take practice at least twice so that they can understand it a little bit better. And then over time, as they start practicing it more and more and more, you will start to increase that timing of how long they're holding it for, making sure that everyone is going to be comfortable in it. So always holding it for a short period of time when it's new. Then when they're in the position, as I mentioned, giving instructions to relax. Okay, so remind them, relax your body, notice the parts of your body that are feeling stressed and try to breathe into them. You know, there's lots of different relaxation instructions that we can give, and we'll talk more about that later on. But to begin with, just reminding them to relax and notice how their body's feeling. Because, example, if we're coming into the cobra pose, many times people will have their shoulders a little bit hunched and their upper back will be tight. So just saying, remember to relax your shoulders, open your chest, and they're like, oh yeah, okay. So that's really, really important. And then giving the instructions to release the pose as well. So if I'm in cobra pose, inhale and exhaling very gently, start to bend your elbows, lowering your forehead back down to the ground. You know, this kind of information is necessary. Now looking at corrections. So as I mentioned, we're going to have a whole lecture on corrections. But there are 3 main types of corrections. So there's general corrections, which is where, for example, I have 50 people in my class, and I can see that many of them are in a sitting position, meditative position, but they're hunching over. So I can say, remember to keep your spine upright, have your chest open, relax your shoulders, head up. So all of this is a general correction. And this is what we're doing all the time. Every time we're talking about the pose, the position, we're giving general corrections. And this is the most helpful way of correcting, because many people will correct themselves when they hear this. So if you've got a big class especially, it will be most helpful, but it's also really helpful just to remind them how their position should be. So it will increase their awareness. And then we move on to the different kinds of other corrections if they're not following that. So example, I have 30 people, 10 of them are hunching over, and I give the general correction of sitting upright. So a couple of them, maybe they didn't hear me, maybe they weren't paying attention, they were thinking about something else, or maybe they thought that they weren't hunching. So that's where I may go to that person and say, please try to straighten up if you can. Okay, so it's just one-to-one, just saying it very quietly. You don't want to shout out from the front of the room, you know, Kate, make sure that you've got your spine upright. You know, I'd feel really embarrassed, don't want everyone looking at me. You know, it's important that we are respectful of our students, and a lot of students can feel embarrassed with individual corrections, and we'll talk a lot more about that when we have that session. But that's an example of how we would do a verbal correction. Example, another way of doing a correction, a physical correction, is where we may go to a person and just very gently touch their shoulder and their lower back. Okay, someone who is hunching, and if I touch them gently there, they will automatically correct themselves. Okay, that's the main kind of physical correction that we may want to do. We don't want to force people into poses. We don't want to be damaging them. And as we talked on with injury prevention, unfortunately, a lot of the yoga injuries are coming from people doing what they think are corrections or adjustments. So as I said before, we'll talk a lot about physical corrections because that's really, really important to understand how to do them safely. But the most helpful corrections are the general corrections. So now looking at revision. So as I said, these are positions that we have already taught our students and we're going to be taking practice. So there are different kinds of revision. So the first kind of revision is just the practicing asana. So example, if I taught the pose in the last class that I had and we're going to practice it today, that's our new practice asana. So many of them might have forgotten the pose because they've only practiced it once. So you might want to go into a little bit more detail about it. You're not going to be demonstrating it and all this again. You're just going to be saying, okay, yesterday we learned Sarangasana, the shoulder stand. Remember, that's where we're bringing our feet up. We're going to have our body in a 90 degrees to the floor, more pressure being put onto our throat, and we're going to see if we can hold it a little bit longer. So that's a little bit about our asana that we learned yesterday. So that's pretty much the main things you want to say for revision. The other thing you want to remind them about is the precautions, because they might have forgotten about those. So that's our practicing asana, and we're going to be doing these in our micro lesson. Okay, so the next one is the warm-up or preparatory revision. So this is where we're going to be practicing a pose that's going to prepare us for the new asana. So for example, today I want to teach Sarangasana shoulder stand. So before I teach that position, I'm going to get my students to practice Viparit Kani, the inverted pose. So when I get them to practice that pose, I'm going to make sure that everyone is doing it correctly. So doing any corrections that are necessary, because if they're not doing it correctly, then those same mistakes that they're making, they may bring to that next pose, which may be a more advanced pose. And when they're holding the position, I'm also going to talk a little bit about the pose they're doing and the pose that they're going to be learning. So if I'm doing Viparit Kani, I'll talk about, okay, so your back is at a 45-degree angle to the floor, and the pressure is mostly on your hands and onto your elbows. So when we do this next pose, we're going to be lifting our pelvis a little bit higher, so that pressure is going to move further towards the upper back and the neck and the throat. And the angle of the body is going to be at 90 degrees. Instead, the back is going to be 90 degrees to the floor. So when we start to give our students this information when they're in Viparit Kani, then they're going to be able to understand that next pose just that little bit more deeply. So it's a really helpful way of warming up the body, but also preparing the mind. And then we have our long duration revision. So this is a pose that we've taught long back and we've been practicing for a long time. So they already know the pose really well, they understand it deeply, and they're going to be holding it. And we don't need to be talking or demonstrating, I should say, how to do it. We don't need to say any of that kind of stuff, but we're going to be telling them how long we're going to be holding it for, and we're going to also remind them that if they can't hold it for that period of time, they can always release it, which is very helpful if someone is feeling a bit stressed. If they think, oh, I can't hold the shoulders down for 3 minutes, but if I tell them, okay, you can release it if needed, they go, oh, okay. So I'll do my best and see what's comfortable for me. So in the long duration asana, basically you can use your different techniques and skills to get your students to maintain the pose for the full length of time. Now, people will maintain the pose if they still have the interest and if they're feeling comfortable. So it's important that you give a lot of relaxation instructions, using a lot of instructions for the breath, also giving them incentive to hold it. So you may talk about the benefits, how it's helping them. If they're not really hearing anything and they're not very interested in the pose, then they'll just get bored and they'll want to release it, which is also very common. So you have to use your skills to keep their interest and to keep them focused in the pose, and then they'll be able to maintain it. And then we move to our micro lessons. So you're going to be doing 11 different micro lessons. And I won't go into the details of all of these today because we'll have our separate little PowerPoints for each of these micro lessons. But basically, all of these practices that you can see here on this list, they're all part of your regular yoga class. So once you understand how to teach one aspect, you'll be practicing it, and then you'll be able to put all of these different techniques together and you'll be able to teach a 1-hour class. So this is a really, really helpful technique for building up your confidence and also your experience in starting to teach. So we've got the initial prayer or the opening of a class. Then we have prepositions. So, how to come from supine position to prone position, or prone position to standing, or standing to sitting. There's different ways that we can be doing that. Then we've got all different kinds of preparatory movements that we teach. Revision. So the revision, we've talked about the revision that they've just learned, the practice they've just learned, the day before or in their last class, and then now they're going to practice it. So it's like a new revision. Then we've got our warm-up revision or our preparatory revision. We've got our long duration revision, so the pose that they're going to hold for a longer period of time. Then we've got teaching of a new asana. So supine or prone, and then standing and sitting, because those are the ones where we have to talk a lot more in the class. Then our sun salutation, fast and deep breathing, and then the closing of your class, whether it's a prayer or different kinds of mantras or something else. We'll go into detail about them later on. So those are your micro lessons, and what we're going to be doing is dividing into little groups, and one person in that group will start by teaching the class. For example, the initial prayer, the first lot is just the initial prayer, so teaching of the initial prayer or opening of a class. After that, everyone's going to have some discussions about it and give some feedback, what they thought was helpful, what was maybe not so helpful. We'll be giving you a checklist, and basically this is going to help to build the confidence of the student, and it's also a learning experience for everybody that's in the group. So it's actually really lovely practice for you all to be doing. And we're going to be doing these different micro lessons each week. You'll start with the initial prayer and the prepositions and preparatory movements, then you'll move up to the warm-up and the revision, and then you'll go into your new asanas and so on. So we'll go into those in a little separate. But just a few more things to remember when you're doing the micro lessons or when you're just teaching in general is that we want to remind them of the breath. So always talking about the breath when they're coming into a pose, when they're holding a pose, when they're releasing the pose, and in between as well. Because if we're talking about the breath, then we're keeping their mind focused, because they can always be thinking about the breath, and they're also relaxing more and more and more. So it's a really, really helpful technique to do whenever you think about it. The next point is always reminding them to relax. Okay? We don't want our students to be pushing themselves, forcing themselves into anything that they can't do. The whole point is that they should relax into the pose so they can get the deeper benefits. So we can talk about the stressed areas. So focusing on any area that feels stressed and trying to relax it. Of course, there are common areas that might be more stressed, but we can also remind them to just scan their body, check how their body is feeling, notice any tension, any tightness, try to breathe into that area, try to relax it. Sometimes you can use visualization. Like sometimes I'll say visualize the area expanding, then visualize that area relaxing. There's lots of different techniques that we can be using. What's important is we are reminding them to relax. And then giving encouragement is also important. Always, telling them how they're doing, reminding them how they've improved. Here I write, giving encouragement throughout the class, especially in full-time revision. So, example, when they're going to hold a pose for a longer period of time, you want to remind them, okay, you're all doing very well. You've already held the pose for 2 minutes. We've only got 1 minute to go. That kind of thing is a way of encouraging. You can also remind them, remember when you first started doing Trikonasana, you could only hold it for 10 seconds or 15 seconds. Now all of you are holding it for 1 minute. That's a great achievement. That kind of thing is nice to remind them about, and so that they can see how they've progressed. It's really important that they can see that progression because people forget. So giving that encouragement, making sure everyone feels happy, but not giving encouragement just to one person that makes them feel competitive. You shouldn't have a competitive environment. Everyone should be feeling that they're benefiting and they're going forward. And there's just a little quote for you to think about as a teacher. Hurry on.